I was halfway through reheating my coffee for the third time when I received the digital notification that set everything in motion. It was not a direct phone call, nor was it a friendly conversation down the corridor. It was merely a brief message on our shared corporate network that read, "Can you send me your comprehensive files on the onboarding process? I want to streamline the operations." The message came from Julian Vance, the recently hired manager who possessed a $200 haircut and the superficial personality of a marketing campaign. I stared at the blinking cursor, looked at my ceramic mug spinning slowly in the microwave, and whispered to myself that I would not tolerate this pattern again. Let me explain the background of this situation. I had been working at the firm, which we will call Northwell Solutions, for exactly 17 years. I did not simply understand where our operational challenges lay. I was the individual who had built our core programs from the ground up. I established the Global Training Division when the entire project was nothing more than an abstract concept written on a notepad during a regional conference. In those early days, no executive cared about cross-departmental alignment or brand consistency. Today, that division has transformed into a multi-million-dollar flagship program serving dozens of major international accounts. However, when the board of directors decided to merge our division with the junior operations team last quarter, they requested that I take a step back to allow new leadership to emerge. I agreed to their request. I nodded politely during the meetings, smiled at the board members, and accepted my role as a senior advisor. I watched the daily operations from the background, hoping that the transition would be smooth. I should have known better than to trust their corporate promises. The very first warning sign was the weekly schedule that Julian distributed to the entire department. The document was color-coded in an absurd arrangement that looked like a child had spilled ink across a spreadsheet, containing 5 back-to-back sessions with titles like Vision Planning, Workflow Philosophy, and my personal favorite, Disruption Mindset Synchronization. I attempted to convince myself that it was harmless vanity. I resolved to let him act as a visionary leader, believing that if we gave him enough space, his own incompetence would become clear to the executives. But then Julian began to systematically rename our core programs. Our Client Verified program, which we called the Ramp and Retain Protocol, was rebranded as Fast Track Future, a title that sounded like a cheap protein supplement rather than a professional training initiative. I tried my best to remain indifferent to these superficial changes. I focused my energy on transition planning, ensuring that our junior staff members did not experience issues during the integration. I met with every new employee, providing them with the guidance and support that I had lacked when I first entered the corporate world. But then Julian, in his infinite wisdom, began to quietly alter our reporting structures. He do so gradually at first and then open. He removed Sarah Kelly from her position as team leader, replacing her with a former associate from his previous company, who had once hosted a podcast about hustle culture. Sarah had successfully managed 12 of our largest corporate accounts over the past year, but Julian claimed she lacked the dynamic energy required for the future. In reality, she simply refused to agree with all of his suggestions. The exact same pattern occurred with Jason Briggs, our senior database administrator. Suddenly, Jason discovered that his access credentials were no longer functional. When he contacted the technology support team, they informed him that they had received an urgent request from Julian to terminate redundant access privileges. I controlled my temper and remained silent. I continued to perform my duties, smiling during departmental meetings while Julian mispronounced industry terms and made vague statements about raising the performance bar. I assumed that our legal and compliance teams would eventually identify his errors. But my patience ended when I saw a client message that was forwarded to me by accident. The email thread carried the subject line, Legacy Process Owners, and the body of the message contained Julian's instructions. He wrote, "Do not worry about Stephen Fletcher. He is more of a support historian at this point. I am personally managing the modernization of the onboarding systems." A support historian. I stared at the words for several minutes, feeling the cold anger settle in my chest. He was describing me as a museum guide for outdated workflows. I took a screenshot of the message, saved it in two separate secure folders, and printed a hard copy to place in my desk drawer. I did not confront him immediately. I resolved to keep documenting every action, waiting for the proper moment. When you play the long game, you do not need to raise your voice or start digital conflicts. You simply need to know where the rules are written and who holds the authority to enforce them. Julian did not realize that after a compliance audit last year, the board had quietly added my name to the mandatory contract review roster. All I required was a single document, one clear paper trail of his overreach, and he delivered it to me. Julian walked into our next weekly kickoff session as if he were auditioning for a television show about corporate executives. He wore a tight suit with no socks, pointy leather shoes, and offered the kind of aggressive handshake that made you want to wash your hands immediately. He began the presentation with a slideshow titled, Culture Reset, Scaling with Swagger. I watched in silence as the young interns nodded their approval while my coffee grew cold. It is always remarkable to watch someone attempt to manage a process they do not comprehend. Julian was loud, fast, and determined to reorganize every workflow without understanding how the systems operated. Within a single week, he had restructured 3 of our training tracks, programs that I had personally designed over a decade. He renamed our training modules from clear functional titles to vague corporate jargon like Ignite Journey and Level Up. As a result, our client feedback forms began to arrive completely blank because the participants could not explain what they had supposedly learned. I did not start a public argument. I requested a private conversation with him, keeping my tone polite and professional. I told him that I wanted to discuss the adjustments to the global training programs, noting that my 17 years of experience could help inform our direction. Julian smirked, showing a complete lack of respect. He told me that he appreciated my legacy insights, but that they were focused on future-proofing the company culture. Legacy insights. I took a slow breath and remained calm. I told him that I understood his goals, but reminded him that we had to keep our processes consistent with client contracts, as several of our naming conventions were legally binding. That statement caused him to blink in surprise. Contracts. That was a word that managers like Julian assumed only lawyers needed to consider. However, he did not follow up on my warning. Instead, he began to modify our shared technical documentation without utilizing any version control systems. Complete process maps were deleted, and our revision histories vanished from the network. He published final drafts of training handbooks that had never been reviewed, let alone authorized by our legal or compliance departments. The most problematic aspect was that he shared these unauthorized updates with our external partners, acting as if the entire organization was in agreement. I contacted the Human Resources Department to express my concerns. I spoke with Emily Stone, a human resources representative who spent her days managing personnel disputes. She provided me with a response that was the corporate equivalent of a shrug, explaining that it was part of the merger transition and that we needed to give new leaders the space to define their approach. They wanted to define their approach by destroying our foundation. I told her that bypassing contract requirements was a significant risk, but she merely smiled and repeated her scripts about organizational evolution. A few days later, I received the message that confirmed my suspicions. It was forwarded to me by a client whom I had managed for 6 years. The subject line was Program Inquiry, and as I scrolled down, I found Julian's original reply. He had written, "Do not worry. Stephen is not involved in the new operational structure. He is legacy support staff who is only here for context. I am personally directing the new path." Legacy support staff. I sat with those words for a moment. This was not merely an insecure manager struggling in a new position. He was actively rewriting our history, erasing my contributions from my own work, and broadcasting these falsehoods to our external clients. That action crossed a clear boundary. I chose not to send that email to the legal department immediately. Instead, I created a new document on my computer titled Misalignment Log for Global Training Division Transition. The document was dry, detailed, and completely objective. I recorded every file version he deleted, every meeting where he contradicted established company policy, and every instance where he referred to contract requirements as mere suggestions. I was not complaining. I was building a chronological timeline of events. I attempted to reach out to him one final time, scheduling a brief meeting to discuss compliance dependencies. Julian declined the invitation without offering an alternative time, sending a message that read, "I appreciate your perspective, but I have this completely covered." That was the moment I realized we were playing entirely different games. Some executives do not desire collaboration. They seek complete compliance. They want you out of their way so they can operate without oversight, wrapping their ambition in terms like agility and fresh perspective. Julian did not want my experience. He wanted an empty room where he could speak without interruption. What he failed to comprehend was that I do not raise my voice, nor do I create scenes in executive meetings. But I do know exactly who within the organization cares about contract language, regulatory exposure, and unauthorized statements made to our external clients. And unlike Julian, I did not require anyone's authorization to contact them. The critical message arrived at 6:13 in the morning on a Thursday. The subject line read, "Reclarifying scope of authority." I had sent Julian a professional email the previous evening after reviewing another set of program modifications he had published without reviewing our standard operating manuals. I had kept my tone calm and helpful, noting that I was happy to walk him through the historical context to prevent issues with compliance. I had even ended the message with a polite closing. In return, I received 3 sentences of pure arrogance. Julian wrote, "I do not care who you are or what you used to do. The old way is gone. Please focus on your support tasks and let leadership lead." To maximize the impact, he had copied 6 senior executives on the message, including his vice president, Mr. Covington, several department heads, and Spencer Myers, the chief operating officer's nephew, who had helped secure his employment. It was a public attempt to humiliate me, a digital statement designed to show the entire department that he had established complete dominance. I stared at my computer screen, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I did not feel angry. Instead, I felt a quiet sense of determination. I copied the entire email chain, keeping every header and timestamp intact. I opened a new message window and addressed it to the General Counsel, Mr. Montgomery, and my longtime colleague in the legal department, Diana Miller. The subject line was "Conduct and Contractual Concerns Regarding Global Training Division Transition." I pasted the entire thread without adding any emotional commentary. I wrote, "Dear team, I am looping you in on a developing operational issue regarding scope clarity and potential risk exposure with our external partners, flagging this material for your review." I copied my personal email address on the message. Next, I accessed 3 historical folders on my computer that had been archived for years. The first was titled Policy Integration Notes 2017, which contained the original board memos establishing the decision authority boundaries for our training programs. The second folder was labeled Board Audit Minutes 2022, which held the specific resolution requiring that my position be included as a signing stakeholder for all client-facing process updates. The third folder was the most important, containing our first quarter contract rollover notes. This file detailed the specific contractual language that tied our training naming conventions directly to the service level agreements of our 3 largest clients. If those names were altered without formal amendments, the clients had the legal right to declare a breach of contract. I compressed these 3 folders into a secure archive, sent them to my personal address, and closed my laptop. I did not respond to Julian's email. I did not write a long defense of my career or demand an apology. Instead, I went to the break room, prepared a fresh pot of coffee, and sent a brief text to Diana Miller. I wrote, "You will see a message in your inbox flagged with the training division initials." Diana responded 3 minutes later with a simple message stating that we should discuss the matter during lunch on Monday. Over the next 48 hours, our internal tracking system showed that my email had been opened six times by the legal team and twice by our internal risk management officers. Julian likely believed he had won the confrontation. He was probably walking around the office telling his associates how he had managed a legacy employee. But he did not understand that this was not a debate about status. We operated within a compliance-governed corporation with strict fiduciary duties and liability limits. He wanted to establish authority, while I focused on establishing documentation. When Monday arrived, Diana Miller met me in a small conference room on the fourth floor. The room had sad carpeting and a flickering light panel that caused a mild headache if you sat under it for more than 10 minutes. She closed the door, opened her notebook, and asked me how serious the situation was. I slid a printed report across the table. I explained that Julian was assigning client deliverables to an external agency called Alpha Dynamics, a firm that did not exist in our procurement system and possessed no security clearance. Diana stared at the document, her pen tapping against the table. She asked who was authorizing the payments for this work. I explained that he was routing the expenses through our operations budget as advisory support, modifying the purchase order descriptions to bypass the automatic compliance triggers. Diana looked at the report and noted that he was also utilizing my proprietary training templates, removing our legal disclosures and replacing them with basic designs from online templates. She exhaled slowly, realizing the scale of the exposure. She told me that I had documented everything perfectly, and I reminded her that I had not survived 17 years in corporate operations by being careless. She smiled, and I knew that our investigation was officially moving forward. We spent another 20 minutes reviewing the exact billing records he had submitted, confirming that he had approved thousands of dollars in payments under these modified headers, leaving a clear paper trail of financial misconduct. That evening, I returned home and spent several hours organizing my files. I knew that when the Human Resources Department avoids addressing a clear conflict, it usually indicates that a senior executive is protecting the individual responsible for the disruption. In this case, Spencer Myers was shielding Julian from scrutiny. When executives attempt to hide operational failures, they assume the problems will eventually disappear. They are incorrect. I resolved to continue building my documentation, ensuring that every entry was framed as a professional inquiry rather than a personal grievance. I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the historical files on my personal laptop. I remembered when we had secured our first major contract with our healthcare client, a deal that was worth millions of dollars and required months of negotiation. The compliance sections protecting patient records were not optional. They were required under federal guidelines. By deleting those sections to simplify the training modules, Julian had not only violated our contract, but he had also exposed the healthcare provider to severe regulatory fines under federal privacy laws. I noted this in my report, detailing how a single security incident could have resulted in a class action lawsuit against our company. In our shared system, where Julian had replaced our detailed integration timeline with a brief vision statement, I added a formal comment. I wrote, "Please confirm client approval for these modifications, as the original contract scope requires phased benchmarks tied to our fourth quarter metrics." I received no reply. On our communication channel, where Julian posted a message celebrating the reorganization of our onboarding programs, I replied, "Will the legal department be reviewing these client-facing updates prior to distribution?" Again, there was only silence. I did not argue. I simply saved screenshots of the messages and recorded the timestamps in a folder labeled "Clarifications for Third Quarter." Meanwhile, I investigated the external contractors Julian had mentioned during our team meetings. I contacted the procurement department with a polite inquiry, asking if any new training vendors were currently undergoing the approval process. The procurement team replied quickly, stating that no such vendors were registered in the system. They requested that I notify them immediately if any individual was performing work prior to completing the formal onboarding process. I saved their response in my file. Every day, Julian made my tasks simpler. He published a slide presentation for an internal meeting that included several client logos, despite the fact that we did not possess the legal rights to use those images. I left a single note on the file, pointing out that we lacked brand approval for external use and asking if we should submit a formal request. He did not modify the presentation, but the system showed he had read my comment. I kept copies of every transaction, preparing my documentation in coordination with Diana's parallel investigation. Diana was quietly reviewing Julian's employment history, his project authorizations, and the limits of his spending authority. The situation escalated when Julian published a department-wide announcement. He wrote that, in alignment with our acceleration goals, we were restructuring the training division leadership to focus on agile impact. He stated that several senior roles would be sunset immediately to create a leaner department. He was terminating Jason Briggs, Sarah Kelly, and Helen Ward without consulting me, despite the fact that these individuals managed our client service level agreements. Jason contacted me shortly after the announcement, his voice tense. He told me that Julian had informed him his role was redundant and had offered him a lower support position. I told Jason to refuse any further meetings and to save all of his communications. I assured him that we were not finished. That night, 3 of our primary clients sent urgent messages. The first email was from a healthcare client asking why their training modules were suddenly missing mandatory compliance sections that protected patient records. The second client, a technology firm, wanted to know why a contractor named Terry was managing their account without security credentials. The third client sent a formal letter requesting confirmation on whether our new materials superseded our contractually agreed-upon processes, noting that their legal team had requested documentation. I forwarded all 3 messages directly to our compliance department. An hour later, Rachel Ford, our senior compliance officer, called me. She asked if I was aware that my name had been removed from the contract approval chain for our largest client. I told her I was unaware. Rachel explained that she had reviewed the audit trail and discovered that Julian had manually deleted my name from the DocuSign stakeholder list to finalize the agreement without my review. My hand tightened around my pen until the plastic cracked. This was no longer a simple corporate disagreement. By manually deleting my name to execute a contract without authorization, Julian had committed forgery under California Penal Code Section 470. Under United States legal doctrine, an agreement executed through forgery is void ab initio, meaning it was never legally valid. This action exposed the company to immense liability and potential fraud charges, as the contracts were completely invalid from their inception. I immediately sent a formal message to the General Counsel, the Compliance Department, and the Board Liaison. I wrote, due to recent modifications in our leadership structure and the exclusion of mandatory stakeholders from our contract review process, I am requesting an urgent meeting to clarify our decision authority boundaries and mitigate our contract risks. I attached my comprehensive log of deviations, including Rachel's audit trail showing that my name had been deleted from the DocuSign system. I did not express anger. I simply presented the documented evidence. The board liaison scheduled the review meeting for Friday at 10 in the morning in the executive conference room on the 14th floor. When I entered the room, the atmosphere was quiet and formal. The tables were covered with folders, and several laptops were open. Julian was not present in the room. This session was designed to review corporate exposure rather than manage a personal conflict. Mr. Montgomery, the general counsel, sat at the head of the table. He did not waste time. He opened the meeting by stating that they were there to review the decision authority within the Global Training Division and determine if recent activities had exposed the company to legal or financial risk. Mr. Montgomery began by reading Julian's arrogant email aloud. I do not care who you are or what you used to do. The old way is gone. Please focus on your support tasks and let leadership lead. He let the words echo in the silent room. He then turned to the Chief Operating Officer and the Vice President of Human Resources. He asked if anyone could produce a document showing that Julian had been granted the legal authority to sign contracts or modify our training agreements without my approval. No one spoke. The Chief Operating Officer stared at his hands, while the Human Resources representative remained silent. Mortimer Montgomery turned to me and asked if I possessed the documentation to clarify our established process. I opened my folder and slid the board-approved compliance charter across the table. I pointed to page 12, which clearly stated that all training agreements required my signature and that any modification without my review was unauthorized. I explained that by manually deleting my name from the DocuSign workflow to push through the client agreement, Julian had violated California Penal Code Section 470. I explained that under federal law, This forgery rendered the contracts void ab initio, allowing our clients to terminate their relationships immediately and expose the firm to breach of fiduciary duty lawsuits. This meant that the company had no legal right to collect payments under those agreements, and the clients could sue for damages. The General Counsel also mentions that Spencer Myers, the Chief Operating Officer's nephew, was receiving a formal written warning for his role in bypassing our hiring controls and failing to verify Julian's background. This addition caused the Chief Operating Officer to sink even lower in his leather chair, realizing that his family connections could not protect them from the legal consequences of their actions. The General Counsel reviewed the documents, nodded, and closed his folder. He looked at the Chief Operating Officer and stated that belief is not corporate governance. He thanked me for my diligence and accuracy, noting that the files I provided had saved the organization from a disastrous regulatory penalty. After the meeting concluded, I walked down to the training department to share the news with my team. I found Sarah Kelly, Jason Briggs, and Helen Ward waiting in the common area, looking anxious about their futures. I told them that Julian's realignment was officially canceled and that the board was reinstating their original positions with full back pay. They looked at me with immense relief, and Jason even laughed for the first time in weeks, stating that he was glad he had refused to take the lower support position. We spent the afternoon organizing our database access and restoring the version history of our client files, ensuring that all of our programs were aligned with the original contracts. By Monday morning, Julian's name was removed from the company directory. He was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, and his access to our systems was terminated. The temporary office he had claimed was cleared of his personal belongings. A few days later, the board liaison contacted me to request another meeting. When I entered the room, Mr. Montgomery and two board members were waiting for me. They expressed their gratitude for my discretion and offered me the position of Director of Strategic Integrity for the Global Training Division, a role that would report directly to the legal department and the board of directors. It was the position I deserved, free from corporate interference. However, I chose to decline the offer. I told them that I had completed my work at the company and was ready to transition. I agreed to serve as an external consultant to assist in training my replacement and protecting the systems I had built, but I refused to return to a full-time corporate role. I had spent 17 years protecting the foundation of the company, and I was ready to enjoy my freedom. I wanted to spend my time helping other professionals protect their work. I negotiated a consulting contract that provided me with flexible hours and a substantial hourly rate, allowing me to support my family while avoiding corporate politics. Before I logged out of my company email account for the final time, I configured my automated out-of-office response. I wrote a single, clear instruction: please contact the legal department for all questions regarding decision authority. I did not add any personal statements or corporate slogans. I simply provided the truth. Julian had attempted to dismiss my career with an arrogant message, and in the end, I had resolved the situation with the documented facts. Now, I enjoy my coffee at home in complete peace, knowing that my integrity remains intact and my future is secure. The individuals who build the foundation are the ones who ultimately control the structure, and no corporate ladder climber can erase that reality with a spreadsheet.